The summer of 1992 stands out in my memory for two reasons. One, it was the summer of global cooling. Mount Pinatubo, a volcano, had exploded in Indonesia. It had blanketed the upper atmosphere with sulfur dioxide, lowered worldwide temperatures, and that was the summer when no one could grow tomatoes, no one had to worry about putting on sunscreen. Often serves as a model for those who think that we can reverse global warming by spewing sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere. But it was also the summer that changed my life. Prior to that, I had been a successful academic. I was a professor of cognitive science at MIT. I had published articles in referee journals. I published two highly technical books in university presses that, like the Ronco Vegematic, were not sold in stores. But it was during the summer of 1992 that I wrote the first of a series of books that actually were sold in stores. And that was the summer that I wrote The Language Instinct, a book on everything that anyone ever wanted to know about language. Well, why did I write the book that summer? One reason is that for a number of years I had thought that there was a niche for popular science book on psycholinguistics and cognitive science. There were best-selling science books on dinosaurs and cosmology and black holes and big bangs, and I thought that everyone's interested in language. This was an obvious topic for a popular science book. I had one of the editors that I'd worked with at MIT Press said, and I paraphrase, is that, considering you're an academic, your writing doesn't suck too much. Have you ever thought of trying your hand at a more popular book? And so that had always been in the back of my mind. But the main reason that I decided to write a book that summer was probably the reason that has led many guys to write books over the centuries, and maybe it's the main reason that all men ultimately write all books, namely to impress a woman. I had been divorced after a relationship that had begun when I was 22 years old and had lasted for 15 years. I had then, I guess all too predictably, since my ex-wife was a short Jewish woman with black hair, I fell head over heels with a tall, blonde woman who was the homecoming queen at the University of Alabama, kind of what Lenny Bruce called the Shiksa goddess. And I realized that the chance that this relationship would actually succeed was probably about 0.6%. But that was greater than zero, and I had to do whatever I could to try to be worthy of her. And her previous relationship was with a writer who had achieved some modest success with a book, a memoir, and a political commentary. I thought, okay, well, now's the time. I'll write my book. So I, in a frenzy of about 24 hours, I put together a proposal. I was put in touch with a literary agent. He had an auction. At the time, there were like 12 or 13 publishers in New York, hard as that may be to believe. And I got a contract. The thing about a relationship that has 0.6% chance of succeeding is that it has a 99.4% chance of failing, and so predictably it did. So there I was. The semester then ended, and many of my friends went away for the summer, and had moved out into a small studio apartment with a Murphy bed on one wall, barely enough room for a computer and books. And I remember it was June 1st, and I woke up, and I was sitting in my apartment with no courses to teach, and I had finished all of the academic papers that were kind of in my pipeline, and no one really to talk to, and I thought, oh gee, I'm supposed to write a book. So I thought, well, I guess that's what I'll do. So I thought for a while, how do I make the transition from academic writing, which is generally not only turgid, bloated, incomprehensible, stuffy, pompous, and so on, but surprisingly lacks in factual accuracy. I mean, as at least outside the sub-specialty that the academic is writing in. So if an academic, basically if you're an academic, there have only been two people who have said anything that are worthy of quoting, Mark Twain and Winston Churchill, and so everything gets attributed to both of those, and the words are used incorrectly and the language is awful. So I thought, well, how do I prepare myself to make this transition? So I went to walked into Harvard Square and I went to a bookstore. A bookstore, by the way, is this building that they used to have. It's kind of like Amazon, but they actually have the books there and you can actually hold them and look at them. So I thought, okay, well, academics, they really often misuse words. So I'll buy a dictionary. So I bought the American Heritage Dictionary, the third edition had just come out. I thought, well, then there's this business of quotations. They always get the wording of the quotations wrong. That always drove me crazy, and attributed everything to Mark Twain, and that drove me crazy. So I bought a copy of Bartlett's Familiar Quotations. I bought the other person that's sometimes quoted, often with various terms that have become cliches in the language that people forget where they originally came from, but I knew that they had come from Shakespeare, so I bought the complete works of William Shakespeare. I bought the King James Bible. That's the other source of many unattributed quotations. Because academic writing was so bad, I'd read Strunk and White's The Elements of Style in college, but I bought Joseph Williams' Style Towards Clarity and Grace, which was the one style manual that actually was informed by linguistics. And then this was, of course, before the World Wide Web, before Wikipedia, and I wanted to make sure that my facts were right. I had left behind in my house the Encyclopedia Britannica, and in this studio apartment I wouldn't have had room for that anyway. So I bought the one-volume Cambridge Encyclopedia that was about that thick, and it had abridged entries for just about any topic that you'd want to look up. Okay, so I laid those on my desk. I thought, well, now I need, of course, I'm writing about my own subject, language. I need to reference books. And I saw there was a little narrow space between the desk and the wall. So I went to Crate and Barrel, and I bought a narrow bookshelf that fit exactly, put it together, went to my office and brought back a crate of books that would, on the material that I want to cover in chapter 1. And there I was. So I started to write, and I wrote, and I took a break. I walked in to Harvard Square for dinner and came back, and no reason not to keep writing, and I wrote, and it was 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock and midnight, and I thought, well, gee, I guess I don't have to go to bed. I'm single. There's no one here. I don't have a TV set, so I just kept writing, and it was 1 o'clock, and then 2 o'clock, and 3 o'clock, and 4 o'clock. Finally, I said, well, I really should get to bed. I guess that's what they say. At 4 o'clock, you really shouldn't be up. I did the same thing the next day, and then a week later, I'd written chapter 1. I thought, well, gee, this doesn't seem so hard. And so I set a routine where Monday and Tuesday, I would read in the subject matter of that chapter. Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, I would write a first draft of the chapter. Saturday, I would revise the chapter. Then Sunday, in those days, there weren't WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get, text editors. Instead, you had to actually tell the word processing program, insert italics here, and if you forgot to say stop inserting italics, the entire chapter would be in italics. So you'd have to run it through many iterations just to get the formatting right. And so that took all of Sunday and the references. And then I would go to my office and print it out in a laser printer and bring back all the books and take a new crate of books for the next chapter. And then week 2, I'd written chapter 2, and week 3, I'd written chapter 3, and week 4, I'd written chapter 4. I thought, gee, I'm kind of writing a book. It kind of helped that one of my older friends who had written a number of popular books, crossover books, had said, you got to realize that you'll throw your heart into this book, but it'll be in the bookstores for 6 weeks, and then it'll vanish forever. So just don't have high expectations. And I didn't. But it still amazes me that I was able to really complete the book that summer. And the more I try to think of how I did it, the less I can understand, because not only did I keep up that pace, but it wasn't as if I was completely living a monkish, asocial existence. As I remember, I went out on a number of dates. I was kind of a single Jewish employed man, which is kind of prime filet on the hoof. So I had no shortage of invitations. I went out on dates, including one that I'll never forget, where I was taken to see a 3-hour one-woman play based on the life of Frida Kahlo. Now, I have nothing against Frida Kahlo. I think she's no doubt that one of the best artists in the 20th century of self-portraits of women with one eyebrow. But I think I speak probably for the male gender in thinking that this is a little bit akin to, do you remember the scene in 1984 when Winston Smith is taken into room 101? Where they diabolically figure out the one thing that will absolutely break a man, that he just cannot stand. In Winston Smith's case, they put a cage over his head with rats in it, because he had this phobia of rats. Well, for me, a 3-hour, one-woman play based on the life of Frida Kahlo is kind of like my Room 101. Only I couldn't say, no, don't do it to me, do it to Julia, because Julia was the one who actually brought me there, and she was enjoying it. Anyway, the relationship with Julia didn't work out either. And I had when I think back on the summer, together with all of this massively productive writing, I had a number of other socially enjoyable encounters. I responded to an ad to buy a used car, and the young woman who sold me the car was moving to Sweden to marry a Swedish man. She said, well, you seem like a cool guy. When I hand you the car, why don't I make a dinner party in my parents' backyard? And you'll just hang out with all my friends. And so it was very nice. It was way out in the suburbs. Her parents were out of town. She was on the verge of moving to Sweden. There was some good food in the back, and there was mint juleps passed around. I remember it was getting dark, and there was a spotlight illuminating the yard. And but it was on a motion sensor, and so every few minutes we'd be plunged into darkness, and still someone made enough movement to set the lights back on. And I remember her Swedish fiance, who's about 6'6", would kind of rise up, kind of like Frankenstein, in order to activate the motion detector and get the lights to come back on. And this was absolutely hilarious, because every few minutes he would kind of rise up and, like Frankenstein, and make these motions, and the light would come back on. And it was a wonderful, warm, convivial atmosphere, and we were drinking the mint juleps, and she took me around and showed me the used car, the hatchback. And then I sat in the car, I read the manual before going home, and everyone left. And then I realized it was like 2 a.m. We were way out in the suburbs. And I realized why it was so funny that this Swedish guy was activating the motion detector, why it was so uproariously hilarious, and that is that we were all drunk on the mint juleps. Now, I rarely get drunk. I'd rarely gotten drunk before. I've rarely gotten drunk since, but I was unquestionably too drunk to drive. I mean, this was like a felony. And I thought to myself, well, I know that I'm drunk, and it's late. There are going to be no cars in the streets. I could decide to drive extremely carefully, just a little bit under the speed limit, scanning for any possible threat, vigilant, and so I could probably get home on my own. Of course, in those days, there were no cell phones. I couldn't call a cab. It was miles from any downtown area where you could even go to a phone booth. No one was in the house. Everyone, including her, had gone. There was no Uber. And then I thought, well, on the other hand, I'm thinking this, but if I'm so drunk that I can't drive, maybe this whole chain of reasoning shouldn't be trusted because I'm so drunk. But I thought, well, if I'm lucid enough to wonder whether I'm too drunk to trust my intuitions, maybe I'm lucid enough to drive home, but then how do I know that if I'm drunk while thinking that I'm too... Well, anyway, I went through several iterations of this. I think I got to fourth or fifth order of reflecting on reflecting on reflecting, and I decided to drive home very carefully and slowly. And needless to say that I made it safe and sound. When the summer was over, and thereafter, I wondered how I was able to achieve this level of fantastic productivity in the midst of having an active social life that I've never had since. Part of me thinks that one reason might be that because I really didn't have any hopes for it, I thought I would just go back to my irregular verbs when the summer was over. I wanted to be accurate, I wanted it to be well written, but I just didn't think that anyone would notice or care, and that kind of emboldened me to just finish a chapter week after week without fretting too much. And ever since then, I do fret, and maybe that slows me down. The second possibility is that since then I was kind of a nobody. I mean, I didn't get invitations to Speakeasy to share my boring stories with all these hipsters in Soho. And so that left a lot of time. I didn't have to worry about all these events. And then, of course, the third possibility is that this was the era before email and the World Wide Web, and I would answer like 3 or 4 emails in the morning, and kind of that was it. I kind of worry that all of these productivity enhancements, where you have the web, so you don't need the desktop encyclopedia or the hardbound American Heritage Dictionary or the complete works of William Shakespeare, might be a kind of poison pill where it actually saps your productivity rather than enhancing it. Well, what about the original goal of impressing a woman, which kind of fell by the wayside as the summer went? Well, a number of years later, I got an email, and it said, "Dear Steve, if I may, I've read a number of your books, and I find them really impressive. And I'm living in Cambridge now, and I wonder if you might be interested in having tea sometime. Sincerely, Rebecca Goldstein." So I guess the moral of the story is that sometimes one's plans do work out, just not when you thought they would or not in the way you thought they would, but ultimately they do work out. Thank you very much.